Okay, is everybody here that's going to be here? I feel sorry for us. The only people in Washington at the end of August, everybody else is in Nantucket, Cape Cod, and here we are stuck in a conference room talking about the Middle East. I'm really delighted to be here, actually. I hope all of you got something to eat, something to drink, but there's more out there if you want to grab it. My name is Richard LeBaron. I'm a senior fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East of the Atlantic Council. I'm also the oldest living fellow, I think, of the Atlantic Council, so I have all kinds of distinctions. But let me talk a little bit about the Hariri Center before I introduce our guests. The Hariri Center focuses on transitions. We're not as interested in the old traditional topics in the Middle East as we are in how things are changing and how U.S. policy can or could or should influence those changes. We focused heavily on Egypt, which is a specialty of Michelle Dunn, our director, who actually is on vacation, semi-vacation right now. But since mid-2012, we've also been doing some work on how the Gulf relates to the transitions in the broader region of the Middle East and North Africa, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE, those countries in the GCC that have been active international players in both the MENA region and elsewhere. Our analytical and our policy focus has been not just to understand what's going on, but to try to find out where the common ground is between the United States and the Gulf regarding these transitions, and where we can influence U.S. policy and to some degree Gulf policy to pursue joint interests, to better define our long-term interests in the rest of the region. This has been more daunting than we had anticipated. The prism through which the Gulf sees the transitions in the region is much more immediate. It's more informed by their domestic concerns. It's more informed by, it's more of a defensive approach, and I think a little bit more prone to see potential for disaster. The U.S. has the sort of luxury of looking from one region to another, working on one problem one at a time, whereas the Gulf sees turmoil in the region that will affect it directly and immediately and could have potentially dire consequences. So given these concerns, certain of the Gulf states have clearly and consciously decided to do all they can to shape outcomes, especially in Egypt today, but also in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and perhaps to a lesser extent in Tunisia. So they are fully prepared at this point to act in their own national interest to shape outcomes in the direction they'd like to see them go, and they're not as concerned about whether those actions are in consonance with U.S. goals. In the particular case of Egypt, we see that clearly. Today we're privileged to have two people with us who understand these issues in great detail and depth, have studied them, have written about them, have talked about them, have tweeted about them. Sultan Al-Qassemi on my right from the United Arab Emirates is probably well known to you all as a leading thought leader on Twitter and elsewhere, directing people's attention to what's important and what's not. He's also a businessman. He's also an art lover. Both of our guests are cultural mavens. Sultan directs you to the Whitney Museum these days for the Hopper exhibit, which he visited in the last few days and highly recommends. I'll come to your cultural recommendation next time. But Sultan is a man of very varied interests and deep knowledge of how the Gulf is relating to what's going on, especially in Egypt. Hani Sabra at the Eurasia Group is specialized in Egypt for some time, and Saudi Arabia is as well as in Saudi Arabia. Hani two things I'd mention. His cultural recommendation is in the Fringe Festival in New York. It's a play called The Future Imperfect.
That's right.
Written or directed by a friend of his.
Allison Moody.
Okay, that's a plug on national TV. And but I'm learning a lot from Twitter. I'm a recent adherent to Twitter, and an awkward one at best. I tweeted something this morning, and the connection I made to the thing I was trying to tweet didn't work, and I was so embarrassed I just deleted it. But in any case, one of the things that Hani reveals in his tweets is his disdain for hyperbola. Hyperbola is defined in the dictionary as extravagant exaggeration. And I think probably that may be one of the themes we touch on today as we think about the issues that the Gulf faces in Egypt. I also need to embarrass Hani and his brand new wife, Yumna, who's right here. They're newlyweds. They're soon to embark on their honeymoon, and I think we should congratulate them on this event. She's turning red. You're not doing such a good. In any case, I gave Sultan and Hani some general guidance on what we'd like to hear about. I'm sure they'll ignore that guidance and talk about something interesting. But I'm going to give them 10 to 12 minutes each to talk. Sultan first, then Hani. Then I will pose a couple questions, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. As I said, we're not going to engage in hyperbola here. We're going to engage in a civilized and interesting discussion about some very emotional, very politically charged issues. And so I look forward to that. And with that, Sultan.
Thank you. Thank you to Richard and Atlantic Council, Tariq Radwan, and everybody else who put this event together. Is this clear? Okay, that's why. So what does the Gulf want from Egypt? Stability or democracy? Are they really mutually exclusive? For some people, they are. I think before we look at what's happening today, it's interesting to take a look at why Egypt matters to the Gulf states. What is Egypt to the Gulf states? I think we could look at the modern history from the mid-20th century. The first Egyptian coup, I think that we're in the third Egyptian coup now. So the first Egyptian coup of 1952 kind of brought in this new regime of Abdel Nasser that was very antagonistic towards the monarchies. It was a regime that was built on toppling a monarchy. And for Saudi Arabia and the other smaller Gulf monarchies, it was a worrying trend, especially because Abdel Nasser started at least assisting, if not encouraging, the toppling of other monarchies. And we saw about half a dozen Arab monarchies collapse within a few years, whether Iraq or Yemen, or I think you had Libya, Tunisia. So there was a trend, and I think this worried the Gulf states very much. Abdel Nasser also engaged in a propaganda war against the Gulf states, and I'm sure that they would have liked to have replied them through Sultan Al-Arab. So it wasn't the best of relationships. In fact, Egypt was engaged with Saudi Arabia in a proxy war in Yemen, in which 25,000 Egyptians died. I think several hundred Saudis at least had died in that war in the 1960s. Fast forward to the Mubarak era. Mubarak succeeded after Sadat signed the treaty with the Camp David agreement with Israel. The Arab League shifted to Tunisia, and finally, just before the Gulf War, the Arab League shifted back. Mubarak was very, very good at kind of maintaining relations with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and with Kuwait. And the feather on his hat then was committing about 35,000 Egyptian troops to the Gulf War. We call it the second Gulf War. You call it the first Gulf War. In 1990, 1991. So that was the largest Arab contingent in the war, and the third largest after the U.S. and Britain. So within a few weeks, the Gulf states kind of had forgiven Egypt all the debts that it had. Kuwait, I think, had forgiven $6 billion worth, and Egypt was once again the Gulf states' best friend after these few decades of not so close relationships. Egypt matters to the Gulf because the Gulf states are terrified of Iran. And for them, the only country that balances Iran is Egypt. Initially, you had Iraq, but Iraq obviously is now going through an extended internal conflict. You also had Syria, but Syria is an ally now of Iran. So I don't think, for the Gulf states, the only country that still makes sense for them as an ally was or is Egypt. I remember quoting the foreign minister of the UAE when I wrote a series of articles on Gulf-Egypt relations for Egypt Independent. And this was when I went and I interviewed Khairat al-Shatir. And I'll tell you exactly the three issues that the UAE/Gulf wanted from Egypt. Then I think they still are the three main issues. One of them is assurances that the Brotherhood, I think this is when the Brotherhood came to power, so we're just going to compare them to what they are today. The assurances that the Brotherhood would not export the revolution to the Gulf. So I think even in a new government, the Gulf states would probably want the new government not to export their democratic model, if there is democracy in Egypt, that this new democracy would not export democracy to the Gulf. I think that's one thing. That it will not compromise on Gulf security, and this is Iran in capital letters, that you would not build relations with Iran on the expense of the Gulf states. These were the two really major issues that the Gulf states highlighted. There is no single Gulf Egypt policy, and we know that because of the divergent Qatari position. Qatar has seen a change of leadership almost at the same time that Egypt has seen a change of leadership, and yet the Qatari position remained the same. The Qatar condemned the bloodshed in the massacre in Egypt, whatever, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia they were standing steadfast with the Egyptian government. So you see this divergent policy continue. You can, because the Gulf states don't really disagree with each other in public, you can judge by the op-eds in the local newspapers that the relationship is continuing to be very antagonistic. Abdurrahman al-Rashid wrote in Sharq al-Awsat a couple of days ago an article very critical of Qatar. He's the GM of Al-Arabiya. The Qatari newspapers also have articles critical of the other Gulf states and their policies. Now, with regards to, we also what happened with UAE, Saudi, and Kuwait offer immediate financial assistance to Egypt to the tune of $12 billion, money that actually arrived. I don't know if you follow international aid donation. People usually pledge and they never give the money, but in this case they actually did follow up and they did transfer the funds. Qatar continues to deliver. I think there's a shipment arriving today. Qatar continues to deliver gas to Egypt, so they're not totally disconnecting themselves from the Egyptian government. They want to maintain leverage with Egypt. And I think that ultimately, if the Gulf wants stability, they will have to push for democracy. And when I spoke to senior Gulf leaders over the last few weeks, I honestly I said that you have to push Egypt to have elections as soon as possible. And the answer there was yes, we want to push them to have elections as soon as possible. But the reason was different. The reason in their case was because the sooner the elections are held, the more fresh the memories are of how bad the days were under the Brotherhood, and so people would not vote for the Brotherhood. So even though the reasons were different, the ultimate goal of does the Gulf want democracy or stability? I'm hoping that they're not mutually exclusive. I would lean more towards they want stability. I think even at least for their own goals, but I think stability will come through democracy in the medium and longer term. A couple of things are happening these days, and a couple of questions I had in mind. I mean, there's a new TV channel launching today here in America, Al Jazeera America, and I would be very interested to see how Al Jazeera America covers the conflict in Egypt. Will they follow the Al Jazeera narrative, Al Jazeera Arabic narrative? Would it be more neutral? Would it be putting forward a certain point of view? The other thing I keep thinking about is the Egyptians today are, the Egyptian government is issuing these very blunt statements. They're very antagonistic towards the West. They almost threaten the West sometimes. It's quite surprising for someone, at least looking from the outside, rather than trying to. I mean, yesterday there was a statement in which the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, I think, said that the West would not dare cut aid to Egypt. So that was quite a surprising statement, and I'm always concerned about whether the new Egyptian government realizes that the Gulf states will never be able to compensate Egypt the loss of the U.S. and Europe, in the sense that you have tourism coming from the U.S. and Europe, you have knowledge transfer, you have, you have economic, not just assistance, but economic know-how. The military has very, very strong relations, not just the military equipment, but the maintenance, the spare parts, the training, things that you can't really compensate. You can't barter with the Gulf. The Gulf can provide you can provide Egypt with funding, and I think the Gulf needs to realize this, that they can provide Egypt with funding, but Egypt will be less of a useful ally if it had a bad relationship with the West, with Europe and America. The army that the Gulf states are very happy to have on their side will be less of a capable army if the U.S. or Europe, and we've heard of some sanctions coming up, or even though they were denied, that there were some kind of news of sanctions. So once again, just going back to that question, what does the Gulf states want? Are they stability or democracy in Egypt? I would say that their priority, at least Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, that they're looking more at stability. But if they do want stability, they will have to push for democracy. I think that they are not mutually exclusive.
Thank you, Sultan. Plenty to think about there. Let's have Hani talk for a while, and then all of us will talk.
Sure, thank you very much, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us, and thank you, Richard, for the introduction. Sultan is a hard act to follow, so I'll keep my comments brief. Sultan went over a lot of the points that I wanted to mention, but I'll talk in a bit more specific detail about the Egypt relationship with Saudi Arabia and what the Saudis want and what the constraints on them getting what they want will be. The first point I'd like to make is that if we look at the Egypt-Saudi Arabia relationship, that's always been one of the key relationships for the last 23 odd years. There's been a lot of media coverage about the importance of the Egypt-Washington relationship, but I think if you look at how Mubarak prioritized, his main priority was keeping the Saudis happy. Saudi's always been the big player when it comes to Egypt, particularly in the last 20 years. And if we look at recent history, we can say that Qatar provided the most funding, but let's recall that the first visit that Morsi made after he was elected as president was to Saudi Arabia. He understood that this was an important relationship to try to nurture. And I think that, he was making some progress in doing that. So, it's very reductive to say that the Saudis hated the Muslim Brotherhood and they were never going to get along. No, Morsi was sort of striking a tone that the Saudis liked. He was taking their side on Syria. He'd become very critical of Iran. So I think that by the end, and even if you look at the overall foreign policy of the Morsi government, it didn't really represent any huge realignments. So I think that by the end, this was maybe a government that the Saudi authorities thought that they could work with. I think that what they wanted was the Morsi presidency to essentially understand their place. That yes, you could get some money from the Qataris, but you've got to make more trips to Riyadh. You have to let us know that we're boss. And I think Morsi might have been willing to do that, but I think when the Saudis saw an opportunity, they pounced when he was ousted by the military. I think now if we look at what Saudi Arabia in particular wants from Egypt, I think essentially they want what the generals want. And I think to some degree, I take the same position that Sultan does, that what they want is a controlled democracy. I wouldn't consider it a democracy, but they want some form of, elections, some form of participation. They don't want to go back to sort of a straight military autocracy. I think they want an Egypt to be stable, but they also want an Egypt to remain weak, because one of the first remarks that Sultan made was how, when Egypt had its first coup in 1952, the strongman that emerged at that point was Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so you see a lot of comparisons between Sisi and Abdel Nasser right now. The Saudis certainly don't want Sisi to be another Abdel Nasser. So they don't want sort of a strong, robust, powerful Egypt. The reality is, whether or not they want that, this is something that would be very difficult for Egypt to achieve anyways, because Egypt is now essentially wholly dependent on foreign assistance. The Egyptian economy is weak. It always was structurally weak. And if you have a country where there are violent clashes in which hundreds of people are killed, the chances that you're going to have a rush of tourists visiting Egypt, or huge foreign investment into Egypt, is pretty low. So let's consider sort of the challenges or the constraints on the Gulf states getting out of Egypt what they want to happen. I think that, for the Saudi vision and for the vision of the generals to be realized, you need a modicum of calm in Egypt, because you do need that inflow of hard currency through tourism and through investment. And I think that that's going to be it's pretty grim on that front. I don't think that that's something that's going to improve in the short or medium term. The other thing I think that's important to talk about is domestic Saudi constraints, right? So, people can throw out these numbers and say, well, $20 billion, $50 billion to Saudi Arabia, that's nothing. $8 billion to Qatar, that's nothing. That's not really true. The funding that these countries commit to Egypt is important to them. And if you look at, just take an example, if you look at Saudi Arabia and say, what was the oil price at which the Saudi budget balanced 10 years ago, and what's that price today? Huge difference, right? And if the Saudis consider their long-term employment challenges and unemployment challenges, and all of the spending on infrastructure and education that they're going to have to do, they have to consider that they might face a budget crunch 5-10 years from now. So I don't think Saudi Arabia wants to adopt Egypt as a client state and have to pump tens of billions of dollars into Egypt every year. That's a constraint. The other thing I think is that, and we were speaking about this before the talk, I mean, you generally don't sort of put the words exciting and Saudi politics in the same phrase, but there is more movement in Saudi politics taking place now than in the last several decades. King Abdullah is 90. For him, essentially, luckily outlived his two brothers. He outlived Naif and he outlived Sultan, and that's allowed him to sort of rearrange the Saudi leadership structure to be one that's more to his liking. He's replaced maybe 6 people in the last year. And if you consider the fact that he is 90 and he has had serious health problems, he's in a race against time. And so his priority, although Egypt is something that's very important to him, the overwhelming majority of his time is going to be consumed by sort of internal Saudi political dynamics. And so I think there are some constraints. I think that in the short term, it'll be very easy for the Saudis and the generals to sort of agree on what vision they want out of Egypt and, throw a few $1 billion their way and sort of set that in motion. But where things end up, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the line, I think it's still a very open question. And with that, I hope I didn't drone on for too long. I like the sound of my own voice, but maybe you don't like it as much as I do. But Richard, I was wondering if you had questions, if you'd want to direct the conversation in a particular way.
I love to control conversations completely, but I'll
So do
try
I.
to not do that this time. I do want to ask one question before we get started with a broader discussion. It seems to me, Sultan, that the Emiratis have been very clear that Islam has no place in politics. Saudis a little less so, I would say, and maybe they just haven't enunciated it in the same way or haven't seen it in the same way. But I'd be interested in both of you commenting. I mean, have the Saudis or the Emiratis, have they made a decision that they just can't tolerate the Muslim Brotherhood in any form as part of the Egyptian political project? Is that part of what we're seeing here, or is it more nuanced than that? And the same question from a Saudi point of view.
I think both countries are vehemently against the Muslim Brotherhood. Hani did say that the Saudis accommodated the Muslim Brotherhood. They received them even before Morsi became president. They received a huge parliamentary delegation of 100 people led by Saad al-Katatni, and I think Naif was sitting there clearly unhappy because just a few years ago he had given an interview. Prince Naif, former Crown Prince and Interior Minister, had given an interview in which he said, perhaps a bit of an overstatement, that all the problems of Saudi come from the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Saudis did accommodate them, but they're very happy to see the end of the Muslim Brotherhood reign. I think the UAE and Saudi feel equally threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood, each for a different reason. The Saudis accuse the Brotherhood of backstabbing them because they received them in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then they turned against them. Whether that's true or not is a different story. And also because the Saudis, and I think Hani is a bigger expert than I on this, but the Saudi system is a monarchy that accommodates Islam, whereas the Brotherhood model is a democracy that accommodates Islam. With regards to the UAE has this allergic reaction to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they clearly do not want them to be in any way in power within the country. They have recently sentenced 64 alleged Muslim Brotherhood members or Muslim Brotherhood members to prison, and there's another trial I think coming up of another 2-3 dozen. I can't remember the number. So for each of them has their own reason to distrust the Brotherhood, but they're very happy to see their end. And I feel that they see that the Muslim Brotherhood was in ascendance across the region, and that with the toppling of the Brotherhood government in Egypt, you have essentially ended their regional project in the Middle East.
Comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sultan. I think he's largely right. I think that, given Saudi Arabia's position in the region, they can't take generally as reactionary a position as the UAE can. So I think that informs how the Saudi government behaves. But I think that, I think the Saudi authorities would be fine with having a Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that's toothless. So, a Muslim Brotherhood that doesn't, if you look at the triumvirate of Morsi, Shatar, and Badia, and you get rid of that generation of leadership, and it's a more pliant Brotherhood leadership that accepts that it won't dominate parliamentary elections or won't dominate the government and will at best participate to a limited degree. I think that that's something the Saudis can tolerate. But I think in general, in the last couple of years, I mean, to use my the thing I don't like, hyperbole. There's been a much more hyperbolic reaction towards the Brotherhood from the UAE than from Saudi Arabia.
Clearly. Well, I want to pick up in the discussion a little bit, perhaps, on the notion of how you reestablish a political project in Egypt that can receive the support of the international community without accommodating or with accommodating or somehow accommodating a different brand of political Islam or a different manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood in the political system, because all this talk about aid and so forth, I think, is really just masking a broader discussion of where does Egypt go now? What's the political process moving forward, not over the next week, but over the next 10 years or 20 years? Where does this society go? How does it get there? But with that, let's take some comments and questions from our group here. Sir.
From the Public International Law Policy Group.
We're going to give you a microphone if you just repeat your name and...
My name is Tamer Negi Mahmoud. I'm with the Public International Law Policy Group, and my question is mostly about where we understand the Saudi government position on the Muslim Brotherhood, but what kind of domestic constraints are on the Saudi government from its own public with regards to the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, you have a large Egyptian contingent living in Saudi Arabia that is heavily supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not clear to me what is the rest of the Saudi public, not Egyptians living in Saudi, what is their position on the Muslim Brotherhood, and with that in other Arab countries as well? I mean, is there significant domestic support that could push the governments to think one way or another? And second quick question is, where does Jordan fall on the spectrum of support versus non-support?
Who do you want to answer that question?
Either of the speakers,
Okay.
please.
Sultan, you want to take a stab at it?
Yes, actually, three-quarters of Egyptian immigrants in the world live in the Gulf. So you're talking about 300,000 to 400,000 in the UAE, 120,000 in Qatar, maybe close to 300,000 in Kuwait, over 1.5 million in Saudi Arabia. Egyptian immigrants in the Gulf are one of the three main sources of income for Egypt. I think after the Suez and tourism. Tourism, I think, is more or less dried out. So it is even more important today than it was 2 years ago. The Gulf is also one of the potential sources of future income as immigrants. I think Egyptian immigrants in Kuwait alone transfer $1 billion a year to Egypt. So it's a very, very significant region in terms of immigrants. And they also play an important role internally. They are teachers, accountants, professors, doctors. They really are the backbone of a lot of the society in the Gulf. And the UAE, in this case, the UAE accused some of the Egyptian immigrants who were there of being Muslim Brotherhood sleeper cells, or people who were working, who were members of the Brotherhood but were also active. I don't think it is not illegal to be a member, but these were members who were, according to the UAE, were active in the organization in the UAE. So there's definitely there's a dynamic there that we can discuss at length. You had the second part of your question, other than the immigrants, Jordan. Jordan, I'm not sure if you read the interview that Jeffrey Goldberg conducted with the Jordanian monarch, in which he called the Brotherhood wolves in sheep's clothing, and the rhetoric was even more antagonistic towards the Brotherhood and critical of the Brotherhood than the UAE or Saudi Arabia have. It was really blunt criticism, and so he's the Jordanian monarch is very unhappy with the Brotherhood regime, because they support the Brotherhood in Jordan. There was this relationship that developed between the Brotherhood of Egypt and the Brotherhood of Jordan that in one way did not go through the official state-to-state level. So he was very unhappy with that. And he came out with a statement a day or two after supporting the military crackdown on the Brotherhood. It was almost a uniform statement from UAE, Saudi, Jordan, Bahrain, Fatah. I can't remember the other countries, Kuwait. So these were several countries that came out with more or less the same statement, supporting the Egyptian military. So he knows, he has two dynamics, the Jordanian king. He knows that he has a challenge with the weakening of the Brotherhood in Egypt. The Brotherhood in Jordan are potentially also weakened, but he also knows that his aid donors, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, will be happy to see such a statement. So there's two ways where he's scoring points with such a statement.
Yeah, just to add to Sultan's comments, I mean, I imagine that the Saudi authorities wouldn't tolerate any sort of dissent or any public support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Saudi Arabia is not a country that's famous for due process, and so any misbehavior would result in arrest and deportation. So I think that they've probably been very closely monitoring the Egyptian community in Saudi Arabia for the last, decades, but particularly in the last 3 years. And so I think that if there's any sign that something represents a threat, they're definitely gonna react to it. In terms of domestic Saudi support, I'm sure there's Saudis who think that the government did a terrible thing by supporting the coup against Morsi, because he was an Islamist. But again, I think that the likelihood that they would take action against the government is very limited, because if you look at the way the Saudi system is structured, right, the regime is structured in such a way that there's always somebody that you can express your displeasure to or your complaints to, somebody in the royal family. and they'll either listen to you and pay you off, or they'll listen to you and say, well, that's not something we're focusing on right now. But the likelihood that this could turn into a threat for the Saudi regime in the short term, I think, is minimal to none.
Faisal?
Thanks. Faisal Aitani, I'm with the Atlantic Council. I guess my question is to Sultan, that the Gulf states are pretty sophisticated, regionally in their politics and domestically, but their attitude towards what's happened in Egypt seems sort of crude to me. Do they not believe, or do they believe, that whatever is going to ensue after this crackdown in Egypt is something that the Egyptian state, from a security perspective, is able to handle? Or do they not think that this could possibly destabilize the country? And for that matter, even if it doesn't reach the Gulf states themselves, are they not concerned about the long-term stability of Egypt? And do they recognize this linkage between democracy and stability that you pointed out?
I think the short answer is no. But the Gulf states generally haven't received demands for political reform in a very warm manner. In fact, it's been the other way around. And I think for them, even during the Brotherhood administration, the relationship between the security sector of Egypt and the Gulf was very much maintained. Today, even though the head of state changed in one country, the security, the interior, the army, they maintain their relationship together. So they still speak the same language over several decades, and they understand each other. I think that they don't understand that it's a very sensitive time, that they need first to encourage Egypt to go back to the democratic path, that excessive use of violence and the killing of hundreds of people in one day was actually not a positive thing. It's a negative thing. It's something that is not to be praised. And I don't think they see it. I think that for them, the crackdown is the solution to get rid of this menace that is the Brotherhood. And I think that the Egyptian military are over-promising as well from their side. The Egyptian military is promising the Gulf that we can deal with this in our own way, and I think they're buying each other's version of the story, and it's very naive to think that you can get rid of an organization that has 600,000 adherents at least. I think this is one estimate I came across, and each one of them has a brother and a cousin, and you can go into maybe the lower million digits. You can get rid of this organization and not have them incorporated into politics. I think that's very naive. It's short-term thinking. I don't think that Sisi can deliver what he's promising the Gulf states. And I think that the Gulf states also need to face the reality that even though the Brotherhood will never be active in their own countries, but the Brotherhood will have a future one way or the other in Egypt. And the sooner that they come to realize that, the sooner this mess that we're going through right now ends.
But Sultan, you meant, in Faisal's question, he mentioned the linkage between democracy and stability. And Sultan's right, the short answer to that is no, because all they have to do is look at their own states and say, no democracy, wonderful degree of stability. And even if they look more closely, they can say, where's the linkage? Look at the country in the GCC that gets the least done. It's Kuwait. They have an active parliament and an aggressive press. But if you're somebody who works in business and you want to get something done, you can go to Saudi Arabia or the UAE, where there's no semblance of democracy. So I don't think that they see that linkage. I think that they see democracy as something that can bring uncertainty, and very often in the early stages brings calamity and resentment. So it's not necessarily a good thing. And on the question of over-promising, this is a theme we've been seeing in Egypt for the last several years, right? What the Muslim Brotherhood promised Qatar, they overpromised to them as well. They said, well, don't worry, just give us that extra $3 billion, and we're going to keep things together until parliamentary elections. Once that happens, we're going to win again, and that way we'll be able to reassert ourselves. And so that's a theme that's been salient in Egypt for the last 3 years, right? And even before that, the Mubarak administration, or regime, sorry, not administration, would make certain promises and be unable to deliver. So it's nothing new.
Sultan, let me drill down just for a second on your answer a minute. The notion that they don't agree with the vision that in the long term stability will come through democracy. I'm trying to think is, from my point of view, I mean, it's almost an existential choice. On the one hand, they're very tactically blind. On the other hand, strategically, it may be legitimate for the Saudis to say, this is a win or lose for us. You know, if these guys win, we inevitably lose. Is that a fair estimation of what you see in the Gulf? That it's just a zero-sum game? If the Islamists are able to establish themselves, they will destroy us?
I think I refer back to Hani's comment. I don't think the Gulf states don't want democracy in Egypt. I think they want a controlled democracy, something that will take maybe a decade or two to finally, and it might take that long as well. So they don't want to see a dictatorship in Egypt. I don't think that they want to see, death and killings and mass killings at least, because Egypt becomes a pariah state, and then it's no longer useful. It's no longer a good ally to them, and I think in the short term they prefer stability over democracy. But I think in the longer term they want Egypt to be not a strong, but they want Egypt to be an acceptable party to other states. I think they want Egypt to have good relations with Europe. I think they want Egypt to have good relations with America. They want Egypt to be economically prosperous. Because they can't keep paying forever, and it looks like even though they're promising Egypt so much money, as Hani said, with every passing year, it costs much more money to balance your budget. The price of oil has to be much higher to balance your budget. And they have different reasons between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. What was the second part of your question? I wanted to answer that.
Well, it's more, how big an issue is this? Is this a survival issue for the Saudis, the Emiratis, or is it a tactical issue?
I don't think, for the UAE, as far as I can see, it is a they win, we lose. But for Saudi Arabia, again, borrowing from Hani, they are willing to accommodate a Muslim Brotherhood regime. They are willing to, not a regime, but a very weak Muslim Brotherhood presence and government. I think they'd be much more comfortable than the UAE.
Yeah, and just one quick remark is that I don't think that most of the players involved in Egypt, whether it's the Brotherhood, the military, the secular conservative voices, or the liberal voices, or the Saudis or the Emiratis, are really thinking in a strategic way. I think that the thought in general is dominated by short-termism. I think that most people are thinking, how do we get through the next 6 months, or how do we get through the next year max? I don't think anybody has a long-term vision of how they see this playing out.
Question on this side, back in the back.
I just have a question to both presenters, actually. And do you think that maybe
What is your
more? My name is Taimur Abdelaziz. I work with the World Bank. My question is, do you think that a more moderate version of the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe in the style of an AKP, could become more acceptable to the Gulf states in the future?
I think it would be certainly more, they'd be certainly more amenable to that if it emerged. But I think that, there's probably some folks in Riyadh who are thinking, well, the AK party isn't as moderate as we thought it was maybe, up to 2 years ago. So, I think it might be, but the jury's still out on what sort of Muslim Brotherhood emerges. And, will the authorities even allow any configuration of a Muslim Brotherhood or any iteration of a Muslim Brotherhood to participate in politics? It's still an open question.
Add to that?
No, they don't want to see. They don't want to see an AK party in Egypt either. The UAE, there was news, and I know that this has been what's the word I'm looking for? I was assured that this is true. That the UAE has frozen its investments in Turkey, even though there was no official announcement. But I know this for a fact that the UAE is very unhappy with the AKP. Saudi Arabia is very unhappy with the AK party as well. So they don't want to see many AK parties all over the region either, because they see it as the other side of the same coin that is the Muslim Brotherhood.
I think they're more upset about the recent activist approach that the AK party has taken. But I think that the sort of the philosophical underpinning of what the AK Party represents is something that they might be more amenable to. I think they're annoyed with Erdogan rather than with the AK Party, you know.
We could do an interesting seminar on Turkey, and keep in mind that Turkey was and may still be the largest foreign investor in Egypt, and at one time was a very large investor, and they do the kind of investment that actually provides employment. They build things, they make furniture mostly, and Saudi aid is not going to build things. It's going to keep the government afloat. It's going to keep the system afloat. It's not going to provide new jobs. It's not going to provide private sector investment. The Turks were actually doing that, and so it's going to be interesting to see if they can come back to a relationship with Turkey, which actually has an interest in investing in Egypt.
I mean, at this point, Turkey is unable to play a constructive role in Egypt, though,
Right.
because they've taken such a hard position that Erdogan's essentially disqualified himself from playing the role of diplomat.
All right, which side were we on? This side? You're next. Here, right in front. You wear an orange jacket, you get called on. It's automatic.
Quite
You
word
can't-
today. My question is for both of you. My name is Rachel Fredman. I work with the Treasury Department. And this is getting to this theme that we're touching on of short-termism versus looking out for Egypt's future economic interests and reconciling that with the Gulf's own prevailing, in the long term, addressing their budget issues. Why channel most foreign assistance through these short-term stopgap measures, channeling funds to the central banks, providing oil shipments versus channeling money through international financial institutions that encourage economic reforms? When I see those kinds of actions, it seems almost like the Gulf is creating an Egypt that is more dependent on their aid rather than encouraging reforms.
Sure. Well, I mean, domestically on the Egyptian side, there is absolutely no interest in economic reform because, any new government that comes in doesn't want to be seen as taking things away from people. They want to give things to people. And if you look at part of the reason the Muslim Brotherhood lost support in the last year was that they didn't deliver on the economy, right? And they were an elected government. They had an elected president. So if you have an interim government that wasn't elected, do you really think that they're going to take the hard steps on subsidy reform? Absolutely not, And even if you look at the composition of the cabinet, it's more, slightly left-leaning people who wouldn't have any interest in economic reform. And I think even, the folks in government see their mandate as to not do anything but sort of stabilize the country for the transitional period. Again, I think that, ministers in Egypt in the last 3 years have been very fearful of taking any steps because they're afraid that I'm going to lose my job, and if I lose my job, I can end up in jail. So why do anything except sort of, steady the ship and wait until there's elections or another coup or another sort of round of violence? It's not my responsibility to do that. So I don't think there will be any economic reform in the short term at all.
If I can just add quickly, Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait will likely commit the same mistakes of Qatar over the last year and a half. Whenever Egypt was pressured by the IMF to lift subsidies and actually do serious economic reforms, Qatar would come in with an injection of $2-3 billion and then give them another 6 months. And so the Gulf states, the three of them, can afford to do this for 3, 4, 5 years, maybe. But then Egypt will become more dependent on them. And when the Egyptian government does take that step to lift subsidies on bread and fuel and other items, it will become even worse. And what they should do is maybe encourage Egypt to lift subsidies maybe by 5% a year, 10% a year, help them or condition their economic package at least with conforming to IMF and World Bank guidelines. But I don't think they will do that.
There's no political capital available to take those kinds of steps.
Tariq, how much time do we schedule for this? We can go to 1:30 or so? Okay, so we got plenty of time. If anybody wants to get something else to eat or drink, you're welcome to. You want to walk around, you want to stretch. You guys want anything? You sure?
If you leave, I'm
We're
taking
paying
names.
them such enormous amounts of money, they're embarrassed to take our food.
Exactly.
I was on this side, I've got to go to this side. Sir. I was serious. You can get up and get some food and not be embarrassed.
Rahman Jiburi, you talk about democracy and stability. What is about the third factors, which is the political thought of the brotherhood? How does that play with the traditional Saudi Arabia kind of, we have the brotherhood believing in taking power and taking government. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, doesn't believe this way. And maybe Hani to answer this, and also for Qatar, where do you see the young prince or emir foreign policy? Is he going to be quiet for a while? Does he has domestic also problem has he to solve, or he just basically taking back seat?
I'll answer the Qatari part very quickly, and then I'll let Hani answer the more difficult question.
Sure.
I think Sheikh Tamim has already answered your question in the last few weeks. He has issued statements in full support of, as well as he has issued a statement condemning, or his government has issued a statement condemning the escalation of violence in Egypt, and his statements were closer to the Turkish statements. So he has already taken a position. There was a huge regional crisis. This is what we were waiting for. There was a huge regional crisis. Qatar did come and make its position very clear. And on the other hand, does he have internal issues to deal with? I think on one side he's kind of buffered because he has over $200 billion in one fund, Qatar Investment Authority, that he can afford to continue his father's policy, building economic development. But also even the demands that have been taking place in Qatar are very mild. I think it's a bit too soon to judge if there's any internal demands from the new emir.
Is there any? Let me ask you one question about Qatar. Is there any truth to the notion of some sort of a religious affinity among the family with the Muslim Brotherhood, or has that been overblown?
Qatar is one. Was one of the Wahhabi Emirates of the Gulf. So I mean, even when they built this new huge mosque, they called it Muhammad Abdul Wahhab Mosque. It's a massive structure in Doha, and ironically, one of the first imams there was Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, who was a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. So you had Muslim Brotherhood merging with Wahhabi. It was a very strange. Sermon to follow. I don't think the family is still very much Wahhabi Salafi, but I think the Qatar had received the Muslim Brotherhood in the 50s and 60s. They had given them refuge, and for some reason, when the Brotherhood in Qatar dissolved, it was a very clean process. They agreed to dissolve themselves between 1999 and 2003. This took place. And the relationship continued to be very strong between Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that a part of it is also being a counterbalance to Saudi Arabia. But we can talk about this forever.
Right.
One thing I want to add though on the Qatar thing, and I don't know as much about domestic Qatari politics as you do, Sultan, but they have given themselves some wiggle room though. I mean, they haven't really adopted the Turkish position. The Turkish position is a clearly and openly pro-Mohammed Morsi position. Mm-hmm. So Qatar has said, well, we're displeased about the way things have gone in Egypt, but they haven't embraced Morsi. And in fact, what they've done is say that, we offer assistance to Egypt as Egypt, mm-hmm. not the Muslim Brotherhood, not any particular political party. So I think that they've taken a bit more of a nuanced view, and I think that on Qatar supporting the Brotherhood, I think that there was a sense in Doha that ultimately if you do have transitions in the Arab world, this is the party that's going to play a big role, and so it's advantageous for us to have a strong relationship for this party that's clearly going to play a big role. I think they essentially gambled and lost. But I think that's partly why they made the bet that they did. I don't know if it's any particular religious affinity that drives it, because if we talk about that, it's sort of bizarro world that that Saudi Arabia is the biggest supporter of the secular forces in Egypt. It doesn't make very much sense. Saudi Arabia is not the most secular place in the world. I lived there for 8 years.
This side, I think we're on. Kristen.
Hey, Kristen Diwan from American University. I guess I wanted to press a bit further about the potential domestic implications in the Gulf of the position that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and some of the other states have staked out, coming out so strongly, kind of in support of the general and the new military government in Egypt. And if, Sultan, if your assumptions are correct, which I think they are, that it looks like the government right now in Egypt has taken a path of trying to kind of eliminate the Brotherhood, politically at least, and maybe even beyond that. And if you think they've overshot on that, we're looking at perhaps a longer conflict. And the ability to sort of isolate the Brotherhood then is going to be really important within the broader Islamic field. And already in the Gulf, I think there's signs that maybe that isn't happening so well. I mean, if you look in Kuwait, you've already had open public statements of both Muslim Brotherhood activists and Salafi, a lot of the Salafi trend as well, condemning Kuwait's support for Egypt. You've now had in Saudi Arabia an open letter of 56 ulama coming out against the Saudi position, or at least against the coup in Egypt. And you've had very, very prominent Islamist figures like Salman al-Oda clearly signaling that they're very unhappy with the position that Saudi Arabia has taken. So I'm just wondering how much, if the Brotherhood can start to portray this, which I'm sure they're already trying to do, as being a work against Islam, you're going to have a much broader segment of the population in the Gulf that could be very unhappy with that position. And in the longer term, how will they deal with that?
Want to start? Okay. I mean, just a couple of comments from the Saudi perspective. I mean, one of the developments in Saudi Arabia in the last few years that has been stabilizing for the government, or essentially it's helped the government, is protests in the east. So whenever there's a Shia protest in the east, the Saudi government basically tells everybody else, oh, these are the guys you want to side with? And that generally succeeds in keeping everybody else quiet, because nobody wants to be seen as to be taking the side of the Shia. But I think I think you're right. I think that on the issue of some prominent Saudi ulama taking a position criticizing the regime, I think the Saudi regime's response is, okay, they're upset. They've expressed the fact that they're upset, but we can soften the blow in 6 months. And I think that this is where, Sultan's point about the Egyptian authorities overpromising to the Saudis that, listen, we're gonna have this under wraps we're gonna sort of control this. We're gonna corral this in the next 6 months, and by that point, you're not gonna really have to worry. People have accepted the new order, and they'll move on. But yeah, I mean, I think it could present a problem. A year or two from now, if you have, certain factors taking place at the same time, if you have a transition in Saudi Arabia, if the oil price dips and all of a sudden the Saudi budget is squeezed, I mean, all of these things are problems with this. I think goes back to the point I was making earlier, that I don't think a lot of the people who are making these decisions are thinking strategically about the long-term implications. They're thinking short-term, what does the next 3, 6, 9, maximum 12 months mean?
This side. Nobody? Sure.
My name is Matar Brahim Matar, fellow at NED, former MP from Bahrain. My question is about the gap between, Sultan, the gap between U.S. foreign policy and the Saudis. I feel that the crack in the relation started with invasion of Iraq, and some officials here are trying to say that in Bahrain, after the harsh crackdown, the Americans would like to do more, but the Saudis were a major obstacle, and there was a conflict between Americans and Saudis. I don't know if it is right or not, but this is the justification for the foreign policy of U.S. government. And currently with Egypt, I think it is also another major phase of the relation. How sustainable did you see the relation after all these escalations in the region?
I think the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is probably the single most important for America in terms of oil, in terms of national security. Even though the rhetoric goes up and it looks like they disagree, Saudi hosts the U.S. drone base. from which the attacks on the drone attacks on Yemen take part. Saudi has some kind of new strange supporter in the Israeli government. So there's more. They see more eye to eye in regional dynamics. So there's Turkey, Iran, Egypt. They see more eye to eye. So I don't think that the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, the U.S.-Saudi relationship will be damaged. I think there will be disagreement, and there is a lot of disagreement. But that's why you have a lot of lobbying, you have a lot of phone calls, you have a lot of visits. The Saudis have made themselves very clear that they would cover any U.S. shortfall, and they can afford to cover $1.5 billion a year. But I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think the army really wants to see Saudi step in and cover all U.S. Assistance, because once again, it's not just financial; it's also military, and the Saudis don't have that military expertise to offer the Egyptians. So I think it is a disagreement that's on the surface, but again, between military to military, they're still very close. Anti-terrorism, they're still very close. Saudi Arabia just gave last week gave $100 million to counter-terrorism and extremism center, and the Americans praised it. So I think it's much more dynamic than disagreeing over Egypt, and the relationships would be weakened, I think.
Yeah, and if I can add, I mean, I think that, the Saudi argument to the U.S. is going to be largely similar to the argument that the Saudis made with Bahrain. That they'll say, well, you might have concerns about what we've done in Bahrain, but it's not a priority for you, and it's a priority for us. And I think they're going to make that argument on Egypt, that, Egypt is something that's important to you. It's going to be in the news. It's going to be on the cover of the New York Times for the next few weeks. But ultimately, it's not your top foreign policy priority. You have your pivot to Asia, whereas we don't. Egypt is still our priority. This is our backyard, and this is of much more critical importance to us. And I don't think that it's something that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is going to get compromised over. I mean, they've experienced bumps in the relationship for a long time, but they've always been able to sort of withstand that, and I think they're going to continue to be able to.
I was surprised a little bit about the tone of the statements coming out of Saudi Arabia. It's really quite antagonistic, quite sort of in your face by Saudi standards. Mm-hmm. That we're differentiating ourselves sharply and sort of nastily from misguided U.S. policies.
Sure.
Maybe it's just a crouchy old foreign minister, but it was very sharp, I thought.
For Hani, my name is Anas Al-Ahmed from Indiana University. I have a question for you, Hani, about the fact that the Saudi Arabia supported Salafi, Hizb party. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is some way how the Saudi try to say, we support some Islamists even.
Absolutely.
But the question here, what do you think the scenario would be if the Salafi party or the Salafis was like in the heat of the regime, instead of the Muslim Brotherhood? Mm-hmm. Is this step taking away with the Saudi or not?
Mm-hmm. I actually don't think the Egyptian military is going to let that happen. So, I mean, it's an interesting theoretical question, but I don't see a scenario now, given sort of the current configuration, where the Egyptian military would allow the Salafis to sort of dominate an election and win, 60-70% of the seats. It might present a problem if that were to happen, but I don't see that happening.
Black shirt.
My name is Sahal Khalawi. I'm a master's student at Georgetown Law. I want to talk about the future and ask what would happen and how would the Gulf states react if the Muslim Brotherhood won again the coming election, and how would the U.S. react if the jihadists win the election, the coming one?
How will the U.S. or the Gulf states react?
The Gulf states act against the Brotherhood and the U.S. against the jihadists.
I think the Gulf states are buying Sisi's promises that he can get rid of the Brotherhood, which he probably won't succeed in. So I don't think that this is even a scenario that they're entertaining, and they should entertain the fact that the Brotherhood, even if they don't win, the presidency or a majority in parliament, will probably still get seats, whether it is through an official party or if they get banned through independence, because they've done this before. I don't think they are entertaining this idea at all, and this would be a worst case scenario for them. How will they react if that happens? I think they would be shocked, but I think that they would. I think that they would probably continue to fund at least the sections of Egyptian politics that are not aligned to the Brotherhood. Honestly, this is not a scenario that they're really taking into consideration. You asked about how the U.S. would react if this happens. If the jihadists win, this is not going to happen. It just won't happen. The military is there for a while. They won't allow the jihadists to run. I mean, you've seen the news in the last 2-3 weeks. There's been deaths. Egypt is today in a state of mourning because of the deaths. So they will not allow jihadist takfiri or jihadist parties to register or to take part. I think this bit Sisi will succeed in eliminating the jihadis, the takfiris. But I think the Brotherhood, who still have relations with the West, who look like they are victims, who have been killed in the streets. I think that they will participate, whether if not in the next election, in the one after it, and they will probably win some seats, and they will not be eliminated, unlike the jihadists.
Yeah, and if you have elections, the next parliamentary elections, if they take place, as me and Sultan were talking about earlier, I think they're going to be very sort of engineered, very controlled elections. I foresee the remobilization of the old NDP networks in Upper Egypt, and maybe drawing electoral lines in such a way, drawing the district lines in such a way that would ensure certain victories for certain parties. Gerrymandering is a big issue, right? I mean, this was a big debate actually when Morsi was president, the debate about what electoral law you'd use. And so I think they're going to try to craftily come up with a way to ensure that the results will be results that they know, that they have sort of a certainty of about 70% of what the election results will be, that it's not going to be left to chance.
I have 2 more questions, then we'll ask our panelists for any final remarks they'd like to make, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, ma'am.
Julie Hughes, the National Democratic Institute. Following up on the scenario that you just outlined, which seems imminently likely to me. That's
not necessarily, right? We've all made huge mistakes prognosticating on Egypt in the last 3 years.
Tell me about it.
Now that this is on film, I can just imagine somebody next year, look at this idiot talking about something he knows nothing about. But anyway.
Yeah, tell me about it. I walked away with a felony. What'd you get?
So.
But that electoral system only worked, and I'm making air quotes, when you had some pretty creative electoral administration going on and less than 20% voter turnout. Now, I don't see that without aggressive state enforcement ever happening again. Rural voter turnout in the last has equaled urban voter turnout in the last 3 electoral events, and those are the votes that were disproportionately nullified, in recent events. There's a huge risk that there's a motivation to uber participate.
Sure.
In a parliamentary election, perhaps not in the constitutional process, and that may be a protest stay away. But so if these scenarios for how the state is to deliver on these promises to create stability are all built on that flawed premise, then what?
There are other means when push comes to shove. Cheat. Fudge the numbers. I mean, these are other things to consider as well. This is entirely possible. Even on the question of voter participation, I'm not sure that it'll be that high, to be honest. I mean, depending on what the sort of the political temperature is at the time could determine whether or not voter participation is high or low. I mean, if you look at parliamentary elections that took place in January of 2012, and then you look at voter participation in presidential elections 6 months later, and you look at voter participation in the constitutional referendum, it was trending down. So I don't necessarily know that voter participation will be very high.
So you don't think there'll be a backlash? You think people will just... I mean, I guess my concern really is...
Anything is possible, to be honest. I don't know, but continue. Sorry.
I'm worried when the state's expectation of events don't match up with how the events actually turn out.
Sure.
That's when you usually see a disproportionate response. And
sure.
So that's sort of what I'm worried about. It's not that they couldn't rig an election, right? That isn't what I'm saying. But if the administration, the planned administration of those electoral events don't meet with the actual reality, do you have some sense of how the state responds?
It'll be bad. I can assure you of that. But
okay, one more. Somebody we haven't heard from. Okay, Sultan, final comment? Any final comment?
Yes, I think the Gulf states should be wary of the promises that Sisi makes. He will not be able to deliver. He will not eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood. They are too spread and enshrined in Egyptian society. There are hundreds of thousands of members. There are millions of them who are Egyptians who are relatives. So this is not going to happen. He won't be able to eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's one thing. Second of all, the Gulf states, at least UAE, Saudi, Kuwait, should push Egypt to hold elections as soon as possible. And I don't think that they should encourage Sisi to even alienate more people or pursue an even more violent crackdown. And I think they should expect the Egyptians to start criticizing their interference, because this will happen. Just like the Egyptians were happy with Qatar and Al Jazeera's kind of propagating for the coup 2.0, they once again turned against them in coup 3.0. So this could happen again. There could be musical chairs taking place in Saudi, UAE, and Kuwait, who are today looked by Egyptians as being allies. Will probably one day be seen as people who are as countries that are interfering in Egyptian affairs. I also think that the Gulf states should make sure that the aid they're given is tied to some kind of serious economic reform, and with regards to IMF and World Bank, because their aid will not be sustainable. They cannot continue to aid Egypt forever without having the IMF and World Bank come on board.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to offer any policy prescriptions so I don't get myself in trouble. But I mean, my closing remarks would be that I think Egypt is in for a rough ride, and I think it's difficult to know where Egypt is going to end up 12 months from now or 2 years from now. I mean, if anything, we've seen that Egypt has sort of continually surprised us in the last 3 years, and I think that's going to continue. The one thing that I worry about is that there are few events that I could see stabilizing Egypt in the next several months, and I see a lot of ways in which destabilization could be accelerated very quickly. And that was my view, a year ago, and indeed we did see things that sort of accelerated destabilization, that accelerated violence, that accelerated uncertainty. And yeah, when I look at the dynamics, I don't see a way in which I could see things improving very quickly. I could see a lot of ways in which things could get worse a lot more quickly. And with that,
thank you to our audience for your very thoughtful questions and comments. This has been a very useful dialogue for me. I've learned a lot. And I think one of the things that I take away from this is the notion that Sultan enunciated, that the long-term stability in Egypt is going to depend on some sort of acceptable form of participatory politics that takes into account the needs and desires of the Egyptian people. And I think that's where the United States and the Gulf are going to need to find some common ground, is around the desires of the Egyptian people. not around our aid budgets or Saudi Arabia's paranoia, but around developments in Egypt that are good for that country. And so I hope that we can find that space together, and I think events like this help us at least define the parameters of the problem and help us thus better tackle it. So thank you again for your outstanding presentations, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.